Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. A new survey highlights the impact COVID-19 has had on Latino families' economic well-being in New Mexico. The survey was conducted on behalf of several nonprofit groups in the state by Latino Decisions, an independent political opinion research and data organization. Joining us today to discuss the survey is Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, a principal with Latino Decisions. Dr. Sanchez is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of New Mexico, where he also serves as the executive director for UNM's Center for Social Policy and is also the co-founder of the university's Native American Budget and Policy Institute. Dr. Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on some important information to talk about. Could you first give us an understanding of what the survey asked and took a look at?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about the survey. We interviewed just south of 500 Hispanic families across the state of New Mexico, and we were really focused on what impact COVID-19 has had on this particular segment of our overall population. So we covered everything from homeschooling and the challenges that Hispanic parents had in that time period, their attitudes about going back to school, and really focused a lot on the economic impact that COVID-19 has had on Hispanic families, asking folks everything from job loss to insurance loss to losing access to pay and what benefits, if any, that they've received to try to deal with the challenges that they're facing right now.
Okay, you brought up a number of key issues there. What were some of the major findings that you found out that you think our community and policymakers need to be aware of with this survey?
Yeah, let's start with the economic impact. I think that's on the front of most people's minds right now. We're going through some difficult times across the state. And our poll identified, unfortunately, that Hispanic families are struggling right now. Give you some data points on this. 20%, so 1 out of every 5 Hispanic households have had somebody in their household losing their job since the outbreak of COVID-19. Another 20%, so again, 1 out of every 5 households indicates that their business has either been shut down or they've seen significant drops in revenue. Just to remind everybody, Hispanics are really the driver of small businesses, not just here in New Mexico, but nationally. So that 20% is a pretty big number. And 1 out of every 3 households across the state that are Hispanic right now have had trouble paying for their rent or mortgage. So you're seeing a combination of all these factors. And even those that have retained their jobs and haven't really seen job loss, 48% of those folks have seen their pay cut, been furloughed, seen their wages drop. So when you add all that up together, it's a very devastating picture for Hispanic families in terms of how this has really impacted their economic well-being.
Now, those things you mentioned right there alone, just the job loss, not being able to bring in revenue for your business, and how that sort of has a ripple effect on a family and not being able to pay their mortgage or their rent. What sort of things do lawmakers need to be aware of that is coming either in the future or is perhaps even already here for many New Mexicans in the state?
Absolutely. I think one of the scariest data points that I've been sharing with a lot of policymakers is, unfortunately, you've got all of those difficult challenges that Hispanic families are facing. But when we ask them essentially, what's your safety net to deal with this difficult time? This is a scary number. Nearly half of all Hispanic families across the state that we talk to have less than $1,000 as a safety net to deal with all these challenges that they have in the moment. 24% less than $100. So you've got all these mounting challenges, but unfortunately not a whole lot to lean on. And unfortunately, a lot of folks, if they don't have access to folks in their network to be able to lean on right now, are turning, unfortunately, to the payday loan type operations that unfortunately have such high interest rates that these folks are digging themselves even deeper into economic debt. So I think policymakers need to understand they need relief and they need it quickly.
Now, you mentioned looking towards payday loans for relief. Is that perhaps shining some light on regulations within the industry that lawmakers perhaps should take a look at?
I certainly hope so. I mean, this is something a lot of these nonprofits that commissioned this poll have been working on aggressively, trying to deal with some of those loopholes, decrease the amount of interest that folks can charge. And unfortunately, our survey indicates that 18% of these households facing economic challenges are turning to that avenue. So I think, like a lot of things right now, COVID-19 has revealed a lot of existing inequalities that are impacting Hispanics and other people of color. I'm hoping that policymakers use this as an opportunity to address some of these loopholes in this particular policy, as well as others that unfortunately have put Hispanics in this difficult situation in the first place.
Now, you mentioned payday loans for relief and people depending on friends, family, people in their personal networks for help and relief. I didn't hear you mention anything about state or federal government. So can you share with us just how people are getting left out from government help?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some positivity here is that overall, roughly 70% of Hispanic households that we talked to received some of the CARES money, whether that was the $1,200 payment for a single person or $2,400 payment for a two-person household. However, the other 30% essentially didn't get any payments whatsoever, and 40% of folks indicated that they didn't get any extra support for the children in their household. So although some folks are receiving that one-time, opportunity for some relief, the vast majority have already used up that resource and unfortunately don't have anything else to lean on. Of that 30%, a lot of folks indicated in our survey that they either were not eligible for that federal funding. Keep in mind, any of our immigrant families across the state are going to be much less likely to be eligible for that funding. And unfortunately, a lot of folks couldn't circumvent the bureaucracy, right? Even if they were eligible, the difficulties of being able to navigate that system are challenging. And so I think it gives policymakers and leaders an opportunity to think through, if we offer, whether it's state funding or another round of federal funding, how do we make the information more readily available to Hispanic households? That includes in Spanish, right? A lot of folks forget that, particularly in your area of the state, a large segment of these families are bilingual or monolingual Spanish speakers. So we have to make sure that the information is readily available to them and get them the help that they need to get whatever funding is available to them. I think it's critical now more than ever.
Now, you mentioned a certain percentage of families in the state had in savings $1,000 or less. This shines the light on the economic vulnerability that may exist with Hispanic families in the state. So can you share a little bit more information on what we're seeing with that data?
Yeah, unfortunately, again, this was not created by COVID-19. The existing inequalities that we see in income level and wealth level and educational attainment, all those different factors, right, have been at play for generations. Now, when COVID-19 hit, it just accelerated these inequalities and shed a deep light on them. So given the fact that a lot of Hispanics across our state work in small businesses, a lot of restaurants, a lot of the businesses that are unfortunately being closed or shut down as a result of COVID-19, all those folks, right, don't have any other opportunity to generate income to provide for their families. So again, it wasn't created by COVID, unfortunately, especially the education gaps. And we're seeing that reflected in the Yazzie versus State of New Mexico education case, right? That's existing inequality that unfortunately is only becoming a bigger challenge for a lot of these families, like, as you noted, don't have anywhere else to turn right now when they're facing job loss or loss in their business revenue.
Now, you bring up education. I'd like to talk a little bit more with you about that, because I know you have some data on how families feel about the state going back to school and opening up schools for students and faculty and staff. What were some of the things that families were sharing with you about how they felt about schools reopening?
Yeah, so I think I always like to start with some positivity from the data. Unfortunately, this isn't an opportunity to talk a lot about positive trends, but when we compare what happened here in New Mexico with our survey to very similar surveys we've done nationally, the upside is when we ask folks directly, how do you feel your school handled the transition to homeschooling in the spring? 81% felt that the district did a great job as best as possible. That's significantly better than our national numbers. So I think our state has done a great job handling COVID as well as the transition, but that doesn't mean that a lot of our Hispanic families didn't face significant challenges trying to continue their children's education. Probably the biggest challenge that was identified in our survey was digital divide. Whether that was a pretty sizable segment of Hispanic households that either don't have access to the internet at all at home or steady internet at home, or rely extensively on their cell phone or their smartphone to be able to access the internet, right? Those folks had significant challenges being able to keep up with homeschooling that really required nonstop high-speed internet for Zoom, uploading and downloading materials that they needed. So a lot of what we heard from Hispanic families was, look, if we're going to be in this situation again in the fall, can we ramp up? Whether that's free computers and the software that goes with them, being able to get them hotspots so they have more reliable internet connection. I think a lot of us take for granted, right, that we have access to Wi-Fi and forget that a large segment of our state, unfortunately, does not. And just some context, unfortunately, New Mexico has some of the highest rates of lack of access to high-speed internet of anywhere in the country. So these challenges are unfortunately going to be exacerbated here in the state of New Mexico.
We've recently seen the state of New Mexico's public education department release their plan for the upcoming school year about going back to school, which included a hybrid method of learning, having only a certain percentage of students at the school for its capacity, and then relying on remote learning for a portion of the school year and during the week. So with this digital divide and the many challenges that exist with it, what do you think that educators and school districts and the Public Education Department of New Mexico needs to strongly consider in order to ensure that Latino students in the state are getting a fair education?
I think the upside is, in the survey, we put a lot of these plans directly in front of Hispanic families and asked if they would support some of these aggressive steps to reduce the spread of COVID-19. And across the board, Hispanic families are very supportive of whatever the state puts in forth. For example, 81% of all Hispanic families that we talked to supported a mix of in-person attendance and online schooling, recognizing the brevity of the situation right now. I think even 63% indicated if they had to, continuing distance learning only in the fall. It's not what they want to do, but they would support doing that. So I think when you take all of that information together, I think one of the main take-home messages from our survey is parents essentially said, do more communication, keep us informed, not only on what the plans are going to be, right, but also how do we make sure that our kids are staying on track? Are they meeting their learning objectives? Are they turning in all of their assignments on time? I think communication is going to be the key. So I think as soon as districts make their decision on what they're going to do in the fall, and you're already starting to see some of that come out, let's make sure that information is readily available, right? Essentially, everything we polled, whether that was providing information on web pages, directly calling, text messaging, emailing parents, all of those polled extremely high, except for contacting parents at their place of employment. Obviously, that's a little bit more sensitive for folks, but they basically said, give us information in all of those formats. And again, key bilingually, right? So we make sure they have adequate time to prepare, just like the school districts are, for whatever comes forth in the fall.
Okay, now, one of the other things that you are asking families is, what can government do? What should they be doing to help respond to this crisis? What were some of the responses?
The upside is a lot of what tracked really well in the poll, the state is already doing. For example, the wearing of masks in public, highly supported, not only in the context of schools, where the vast majority, I think almost 90% of Hispanic families said they would support both students and teachers and administrators all wearing masks in the school place. But we also asked a lot of essential employees in this poll, folks that are still working outside of the home, what can the state do to make you feel safer? And essentially everything the state's already doing polled very highly, including wearing masks in public, frequent breaks to be able to ensure that folks have their PPE in place and can wash their hands frequently, as well as ensuring that customers, whenever they interface with them on their job, are also wearing masks and really responding proactively to social distancing. So I think a lot of it is continue doing what we're doing. I know some of this is unpopular across some segments of the state, but at least among Hispanic families, everything the state is doing is polling very well, and people actually appreciate how this is impacting their ability to feel safe. One other positive data point, the vast majority of folks we talked to that were essential workers indicated they feel safe right now in their place of employment, much higher percentage than what we're seeing nationally from Latinos in other states. So I think a lot of this said some signals that what we're doing is working and we got to stick with it.
New Mexico state lawmakers recently met in a special session, mainly to focus on dealing with the budget, which the state is seeing a drastic reduction in revenue due to the fall in oil and gas prices in the state, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it's impacted the globe. What were some of the things that you took from the special session that you think may assist families?
Well, I think there was some positivity there. I think the state legislature and the governor are doing as much as they can for COVID relief. But our survey indicated that folks want to see more of that, whether that's for small businesses, directly for employees that have been impacted, unemployment opportunities that extend far beyond what the federal government is providing, which is about to run out for a lot of folks. And I think a lot of folks just indicated, look, this is something that's probably going to be here for a little bit longer than we all hoped. So thinking about relief can't be a one-time thing that comes and goes. We're going to have to really think about longer-term safety nets for a lot of these folks that unfortunately are going to find themselves in a much darker economic period when we roll out of this than they started. And I think really the survey indicates support across the board for any creative ideas, right, that the state can put forth to provide relief to families right now.
What do you see being addressed in the next legislative session? Obviously, we have an election that could change everything coming up here in November, but looking forward to 2021 in New Mexico, the legislative session, it'll be a longer one. So what are state lawmakers considering that you may think may provide some solutions for this issue?
Well, I think a couple of things that this poll indicated specific to education is that essentially what COVID-19 has done is indicated that the inequalities that were already in place are huge burdens for a lot of families. Whether we're talking about Hispanic households or Native American households, the impact of not having access to Wi-Fi has been huge, not just in terms of homeschooling, but being able to find other work, logging on to be able to apply for unemployment. That existing inequality needs to change, and hopefully that's something the legislature can do a little bit more aggressively in the next session. And I think bigger picture, not just in this poll, but a lot of the other surveys we've conducted across the state of New Mexico in the last few months indicate that the public is hungry for aggressive steps to diversify our economy. I think as folks pay attention to the news and they saw the drastic drop in oil prices because demand almost came to a screeching halt, I think a lot of folks for the first time realized how sensitive our state's economy is to oil and gas revenue. And so I think what we're seeing in the data is folks are saying, look, let's use this as an opportunity to really transform the state's economy, and are basically giving lawmakers an opportunity to be creative in that approach, whether that's moving more aggressively to movement away from fossil fuels into clean energy and hopefully seeing jobs and economic development around that, or any other creative ideas. I think a lot of the population recognizes, look, things might not ever be the same as they were before COVID-19. Let's get out ahead of this and let's not be as reactive to the situation, so that hopefully, next generation, if there's another scare like this, we'll be much more equipped as a state to tackle it.
Now, one thing that we know this pandemic has shined a light on is the issue of healthcare and health insurance in not only New Mexico, but the entire country. There's been some numbers thrown around, and we may not find out the exact numbers until later, but millions of people in the United States do not have health insurance. So what do you think this issue is doing impacting families in New Mexico? How major of an issue is this? Because you mentioned that families were losing employment, losing revenue, and also having to cut their hours. So how is this affecting healthcare for New Mexicans in the state?
Yeah, we tracked that directly in the poll. We saw a sizable segment of families, largely as a result of losing their provider-employer health insurance because they've lost their job, also losing their health insurance. Among that segment, 26% indicated that their children have also lost access to health insurance. So I think we're seeing this play out. Remember, our survey was conducted first couple of weeks in June. So over the past month, I suspect that number, if anything, has grown across the state and will continue to do so as folks start to lose their health insurance as a result of not only losing their job, but remember, a lot of these folks went from full-time employment to now part-time employment. For many folks, that means losing access to their provider-employer health insurance. So we're seeing consistently in our polls, not just here in New Mexico, but nationally, because I think this is a huge gaping issue. A lot of folks now are realizing there's much greater support for things like universal health insurance, right? Figuring out ways to subsidize this for families who can't afford it. So again, I think it provides an opportunity to take a closer look at the healthcare industry and figure out how do we reform this so people have basic access to health insurance, right? I think now people understand if I don't have health insurance, I don't have access to preventative care. And obviously that really multiplies and creates huge health challenges when we could nip it in the bud by just giving people basic access.
Now, during this pandemic, the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to consider throwing out the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. How do you think, if that should happen, could that have an impact on the state of New Mexico? How big of an impact?
Oh, that would be huge for the state of New Mexico. Just for some context, New Mexico, by all indicators, don't just trust our data, right? You can go to any of the other think tanks across the country, indicated that the increase in insured population in New Mexico was among the highest in the United States across all states, either ranked number 1 or number 2. So we benefited significantly from the ACA, and Governor Martinez's wise decision at that time to participate in the ACA, particularly as it related to Medicaid. So I think as we think about potentially rolling that back, a lot of the gains that were made in access to health insurance across the state of New Mexico could be wiped out just like that. I mean, we're already starting to see that with COVID-19. Imagine if you accelerate that by doing away with the ACA. I think that would be devastating for the state of New Mexico. And that's something, obviously, I'm hoping does not happen. But I think as our state starts to look at what could happen in the November election, we should be making preparations to do as much as we can at the state level to try to ensure that a lot of the population across the state doesn't lose access, right, to that basic, right, access to healthcare through insurance. I think it would be devastating also to the state's economy, right? The healthcare industry in the state is huge and is actually growing, one of the sectors that is actually on an increase. That could all be done away really quickly, unfortunately, if we really repealed the ACA like President Trump would like to do.
How big of an issue was hunger around the families that you surveyed? I noticed in some of the results that was a top issue that they were concerned about. There was a lot of basic issues regarding health and safety during this pandemic that families were concerned about. Hunger, a major issue I saw in one of the surveys. How big of an issue?
Yeah, it's significant. I mean, even though it didn't poll quite as high when we asked folks directly what's the most important issue you're facing right now, government should address, still a sizable segment said basic access to necessities like food was a major challenge. Right? And so whether that's folks that live in rural areas of our state who have difficulty being able to travel, particularly with travel restrictions and the fear of COVID-19, or as a result of the economic impact, right? Not having the basic resources financially to be able to pay for day-to-day groceries. This is a huge challenge. Again, that was already in play in New Mexico and has only accelerated because of COVID-19. I think one of the things, particularly in our poll, that stood out is for a lot of families, right, access to daily meals for their children comes from the school. And so as that's being shut down and schools are doing their best to be able to make those meals available, I've even seen very smart approaches like having drive-up opportunities for families to be able to get access to those meals for their children. That's vital. But we have to keep in mind, as COVID potentially spikes again in New Mexico, how many families are going to be worried about venturing out of their home to go stand in line to get access to those free meals? All of this, right, is new territory for our state, just like it is nationally. I think the more of us that can think through the safest way to be able to make sure that children in particular don't face hunger issues on top of everything else, I think we can come up with some plans to make sure that folks just get access to basic necessities like food. I mean, it's a shame that we're talking about food insecurity, but obviously that's something in the state of New Mexico we've been dealing with well before COVID even hit.
Yeah, there's so much that is happening right now during this pandemic. Another issue that has really captured the attention is the police killing of George Floyd, which sparked a national dialogue on some action on policing and also regarding criminal justice reform. Now, how are families feeling about this issue?
Well, we were fortunate, right as this poll was about to field, we took a look at the national landscape and saw, unfortunately, with the killing of Mr. Floyd and a lot of the media portrayal of that, widespread protests across New Mexico, we were able to ask Hispanic families directly some of these questions. A couple of things that I think are important. One is that a lot of Hispanic families have indicated that they have either watched the Floyd video with their children themselves, or they know that their children have watched the video. When you add those two together, I think it was close to 70% of kids age 18 or younger have seen the video. So as kids are paying attention and they're like little sponges soaking up all this information, it's really important that all of us take some opportunity to talk with kids about this before they get to school, because they're coming with a lot of different baggage, right? Whether it's on police brutality, racial inequality, things that they're thinking about that they probably were not before COVID-19 hit. And so I think the more we can educate them and use this as an opportunity, the better. One positive data point, 82% of Hispanic families have indicated that they've used this opportunity, right, to actually talk with their children about racial inequality, police brutality. I think that gives us some hope that the next generation will be a little bit more enlightened and more open-minded to some of these issues than even maybe my generation or the generation behind me was, because we just didn't talk about these things at home. So I think that gives us an opportunity to really hopefully have deep conversations with the next generation about these issues so that hopefully they can come up with better solutions to them than we have.
Now we just have less than a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask you a question regarding the 2020 election and Latino voting. We've seen some data released by the Pew Research showing how Latinos have grown in certain states where their population wasn't really that high in recent years. So how do you think this is going to impact the 2020 election, considering all these issues that are happening right now?
Well, the key, and this I've been consistent on, the key for Latino population impact in this next election comes down to the youth vote. I mean, people forget, because Latinos in New Mexico as well as nationally are in some cases 18 years younger in median age than non-Hispanic whites are. Our eligible voter population is essentially under 40. Roughly 50% of all Latino eligible voters are under the age of 40. So it means figuring out ways to mobilize these young people, right? We see that they're highly interested in reform. We're seeing them protest and march in the streets, in some cases risking their life to try to reform the system. So the energy is there, the desire is there. We have to figure out how to translate that to actually using the ballot box and voting as a mechanism of creating change. So I think if we can figure that out and the candidates can speak to those issues that young people care about, we'll see Latino turnout probably break records. Now, if that doesn't happen, given the demographics, unfortunately, we might be looking at it and say, why did Latinos not turn out in 2020?
Dr. Gabriel Sanchez is a principal at Latino Decisions. He is also a professor at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I always appreciate being able to talk about some hard data. Thank you.
And we want to thank you for watching Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.